Ah, happy 2025. This was meant to be a Christmas episode, but things really got out of hand, most of it having to do with Halo. Yeah, I really haven't had a break for a few months. It's a shame that we miss Christmas too, because Santa Claus and Delta Force have many similarities. They both know when you're sleeping, they both know if you've been bad or good, although if you've been on the naughty list, Delta doesn't give you coal. It's mostly 5.56, with the occasional 40mm, but only if you've been extra bad this year. I think it's about time to take a look at an era long forgotten, an era before Call of Duty 4, or Battlefield 2, where the modern military genre was dominated by milsims. Ubisoft had Rainbow Six, Bohemia Interactive had Operation Flashpoint, and NovaLogic, well, they had Delta Force. It was a series that followed fictional military conflicts around the world, putting the player into the boots of the famed but mysterious Delta operators. It's always seemed like an interesting series to me, because it's remained a strongly defended cult franchise, despite its faults, shortcomings, and especially its competition. The Delta Force series has always been a beloved little corner of the PC gaming world. For a lot of people, myself included, it's practically a PC staple. Those gritty, bright red and yellow boxes used to be prolific on the shelves of computer stores. The series started in the late 90s, and slowly NovaLogic was adding sequel after sequel. They even made a console port. By 2003, they finally made what a lot of people say is their magnum opus, Delta Force Black Hawk Down. By far their most remembered title. It had cinematic action, a ton of content, and it was steeped in real history, based off the book of the same name. Not the movie. That's a common misconception. And yeah, of all the games in the franchise, Black Hawk Down often remains the most popular. It's the one that I find most people have fond memories over. Well, more than 20 years have gone by, and I always thought it was at least worth revisiting, if only for the trouble the series has gone through as of late. Yeah, Delta Force is in very different hands now than it was a couple decades ago, mostly being Chinese spyware, I guess. So I wanted to jump back to 2003, to, I guess, jump back again to a semi-fictional 1993 and experience the game for myself. So let's load up our gear, grab our M16s, and get ready for our sortie. Delta Force Black Hawk Down follows a mostly fictionalized and exaggerated series of events that surround Operation Gothic Serpent. This was the US involvement in Somalia, and more specifically, the conflict in Mogadishu. In the early 90s, the Somalian civil war was raging, as multiple rebel factions and warlords brutally fought each other for territory and supplies. The UN tried to intervene in 1992 to help the people caught in the crossfire, but as the fighting ramped up, it turned from a humanitarian mission into something more akin to a war zone. The US, along with multiple nations, found themselves in an all-out war with one of the leading factions, the SNA, Somali National Alliance. By the summer of 1993, the SNA and its leader, General Aidid, became public enemy number one, thanks to their constant ambushes on UN troops. This is where the game kicks off, and this is where the game diverges from history, because its first couple missions have Delta Force fighting in early 1993. Looks like around March and April. This is months before they were actually brought into the region. Officially, Delta Force didn't show up until August, and they were only there for a couple months, not all year. Granted, I recognize that there are many parts of Delta Force shrouded in secrecy, so the implication that they were working in Somalia a little earlier than in real life, that's not too much of a stretch when it comes to historical fiction. Although I don't think the real Delta Force had missions to kill crocodiles. And that's kind of the premise. The game loosely follows the events of 1993 up until the titular event itself, the Black Hawk Down incident. But for the most part, you're doing miscellaneous made-up missions, although not completely separated from history. We'll get into that. But we have our historical context. We have our objective. Stop the SNA and protect UN peacekeepers. But before we can begin, we need to get this thing working on modern hardware. Getting a widescreen fix for this game was pretty much my own personal war. For starters, the game is no longer available anywhere. Not Steam, not GOG. The game used to be there, but the rights holders pulled it earlier this year. It's abandonware, baby. It's annoying, but the silver lining is that you aren't stuck with the Steam copy, like I was. The Steam copy, unsurprisingly, is the unpatched version of the game. To get any mods working, you're gonna need patch 1.505. So I somehow managed to get myself a .exe of the game patched to this version. Let's just say Somali pirates aren't the only pirates in this video. So now I needed to see if I could get the game running at HD with a higher FOV. Like an idiot, I ignored the PC Gaming Wiki advice and tried to use a couple fan patches first. I tried what I thought would be a good fix by someone named Sua Machine. It was a wrapper for the game that was apparently based on a much larger mod, and it claimed that it could make the game run at a higher resolution with a custom FOV. I installed it, and it worked. HD resolution, widescreen, high FOV. Nice. I thought I was set, until I died once. Reloading a quick save does this. Oh yeah, we're doing lots of competitive gaming with an FOV this high. Sua Machine is an apt username. I guess I could technically play the game without dying, but that's not practical. Delta Force is a game where you need those quick saves. The game rations them out for a reason, so this mod will not do. I tried looking for another HD fix. I tried DG Voodoo 2, as I often do, and it seemed like it was a good option. It worked briefly. The game was running at HD, except it created one of the weirdest, most bizarre bugs I have ever seen in a game. Okay, so Delta Force has a map menu. It looks like this. You've got the layout of the map, and then you've got a grid overlay on top of it. What happened was this in-game map was actually overlaid onto the world itself. So looking at the ground, you could see those grids. It actually looks kind of cool, and if I was playing Arma, this would be a really nasty hack to provide better callouts. But I don't need this in Delta Force. So I did what I should have done from the beginning. I checked PC Gaming Wiki. And yeah, their fix is way better. Universal widescreen and an FOV cheat engine table. What do you know? It works perfectly. Forgive me, PC Gaming Wiki. I'm sorry I ever doubted you. With that out of the way, we're ready to start shooting. And the combat is deceptively simple. All guns do hyper-realistic amounts of damage, which is to say in the context of a military shooter, instant death. A burst from any gun, so long as you land the shot, will kill an enemy no problem. You and your Delta squad mates can also tank a couple rounds while the enemy cannot. That actually does make some sense. You're all clad head to toe in Kevlar and body armor, and the guys shooting at you, the S&A, are wearing like shirts and jeans. So that makes sense. The guns themselves are all your standard military shooter affair, and it's pretty limited. You have a SAW, M60, MP5, a Remington 870, the M12, M24, as well as a bunch of M16 variants, which will be your workhorse through the campaign. The game already wins brownie points because it has the M16A2 in its classic late 80s M203 heat shield. Any game that has that has a special place in my heart. The DLC added a few new weapons as well, but for the most part, you're going to be using M16s or CAR-15s. I found myself occasionally swapping to other guns, but just to add variety, because if you aren't too careful, this game will just turn into an M16 version of Whack-A-Mole. Explosives are pretty fun. You get satchel charges, which are mostly reserved for objectives. You can get an AT-4, which is pretty awesome. And yes, you can use your M203s in a pinch. A few levels like to spice it up by having some guns favored over others. Like levels that have you set in a large open field with very little cover are great for snipers. A stealth mission will make great use of the silenced MP5. Or if you're going to be sitting in a vehicle and you need to give cover fire, use an LMG. So it's got an acceptable amount of variety, but it could be better. And yeah, the combat speaks for itself. It's simplistic. Shockingly so. This is not Rainbow Six. Enemies are aggressive, but they are very basic in terms of behavior. The AI is laughably simple, but it makes sense when you consider how many enemies the game will throw at you. I want to say that there's no level in this game where you're killing less than 100 enemies. I think them being dumbed down helps the game from being relentless, because if they all had Halo 2 sniper jackal aim, yeah, this game would not last 2 seconds. You also need to be aware of the ROE. The rule of engagement here is that only enemies who are armed are declared hostile. And you really need to be careful because these guys love to throw themselves into crowds of unarmed civilians. Occasionally you get a turret sequence, but for the most part, this is all the gameplay is. Shooting at guys at long range, medium range, and close range, with guns that are all mostly pretty damaging and accurate and will get the job done no matter what. I found that most criticism towards Delta Force boils down to the simplistic gameplay, because in addition to combat, you have control over your teammates. Or should I say, lack of control. Yeah, of all the things I want out of a Delta Force game, the lack of any meaningful squad commands is probably my biggest problem with it. Now you do get a list of commands to use, such as hold an area, follow me, increase or shorten our spacing, but it's questionable because these commands are rarely used. Holding an area never really happens, because you're constantly on the move. This is fucking Mogadishu. We aren't capturing territory, we're hitting targets and flying back to base. We're doing hit and run tactics. Having more detailed commands for individuals in your squad, maybe giving them some dynamics, would have gone such a long way. Like assigning loadouts to your teammates. Maybe have one guy on sniper duty, or one guy giving suppressive fire with a saw. Maybe pack a guy with explosives and satchel charges, or outfit a guy with just a bunch of ammo. Maybe have a medic who can administer aid after one of us has been shot. The game has a mechanic that lets your teammates stack up on a door and toss a flashbang, so you can try and pull off a breach and clear. Except this never works. Your teammates have so much trouble pathing their way to the door that they're either going to get stuck on some piece of geometry or will just refuse to walk up to you. So you end up having to clear the room yourself. I wish the game would encourage this, but as it is, it's just kind of broken. Overall, the squad mechanics are kind of disappointing. There needs to be more commands here. More mechanics to have your squad move as a dynamic unit instead of just, I don't know, a squad of nameless soldiers. You know what? That's what it feels like. It feels like Halo. It feels like I'm Master Chief and I've got a bunch of Marines following me. This isn't how a Delta squad should handle. All of these guys should be their own Master Chiefs. And this was pretty inexcusable for the year it came out in. Black Hawk Down released this same year as Rainbow Six 3. By 2003, there were plenty of tactical shooters on the market, and I would argue that squad mechanics had already been figured out. NovaLogic were just late to the party. And the worst part is that because you use these commands very rarely, you kind of lose any meaningful connection to your squad. In another tactical shooter, losing a member of your team is a punch to the gut. Not only is it mechanically disruptive because your team is now down one man, but you also feel bad for losing them because other games have you very reliant on your squad. Your team moves as one. So when you lose a squad mate, it's almost like you lose a metaphorical part of yourself. But here it's nothing. I'll just carry on with the mission like normal. I was kind of shocked at how a teammate would die and I would just kind of shrug it off. A game called Delta Force should not be letting the player feel this way. This is where a simple gameplay mechanic can truly affect the game's tone. So yeah, that's the combat. On its own, it's okay. Guns are fun to use for the most part, but you have little to no control over your squad. And as such, you no longer feel like you're commanding a team. Rather, you're just some guy with a trail of ducklings following him who are incapable of fighting on their own. Typically, I would move on to the campaign or level design, but I think we need to talk about presentation. More specifically, how NovaLogic were able to portray Mogadishu. Delta Force Black Hawk Down was a 2003 PC game, and man, it sure looks good in some parts, and really dated in others. NovaLogic was an interesting developer because they specialized in military sims dating all the way back to the 90s. You had naval sims, tank sims, and a lot of aircraft sims. You had F-22, MiG-29, F-16, but the most well-known of their games has to be Comanche and maybe Armored Fist. Both of them utilized an experimental voxel engine, which cemented NovaLogic's level design. Large open environments with scattered buildings, but mostly empty hills and fields. It was for vehicular combat. This was incredibly innovative for the time. And so NovaLogic wanted to try a different type of milsim that wasn't from the perspective of a tank or aircraft. Delta Force was their first attempt at a first-person shooter, and since the engine that they used for Comanche was the only one they had, that's what the game was using. So you have that giant open environment, but now the player's seeing it from ground level. This is kind of what led to Delta Force's interesting aesthetic, if you can even call it that. That being large open and fairly empty environments, with lots of long-range shooting and sniping. I would describe the early Delta Force games as you just kind of running around this giant landscape, going through rolling hills and terrain, and occasionally running into a guy who'll shoot at you. At the time, it was impressive, but by Comanche 4, NovaLogic had ditched the voxels, and they moved on to a brand new polygonal engine. But Delta Force would be stuck with this aesthetic. Delta Force Black Hawk Down was using Comanche 4's brand new engine as well. So you have a ground-based first-person shooter using an engine designed for a helicopter game. This should explain some things. Environments are big, open, and barren. Buildings are blocky and simplistic. Lots of signs that the engine clearly was designed for aerial combat first and foremost. Not an FPS. Delta Force always kind of reminded me of something like Operation Flashpoint. It's a fairly flat-looking game that you can tell was designed as a simulator first before being retrofitted as a cinematic linear action game. I think the visuals fall apart in some areas, but hold up well in others. For example, vehicles are rendered very well. The interior of helicopters look great. Guns are all nicely modeled. The Delta and Ranger models look pretty good too. But the inverse of that is enemies look hilariously low quality, even for 03. With the flat lighting and basic geometry, there are many parts of this game that even I'll admit look kinda ugly, even for the year it came out in. But what the game excels at is its sense of scale. And this might explain why things like lighting and models and textures have to be basic. These are huge environments. You can stare off into the horizon and see an entire city around you. There's distant hills, a never-ending coastline. I tried to figure out why, despite the game's dated graphics, it still kinda looked impressive. Like, I have seen plenty of games from this era that look way better than this, yet I couldn't put my finger on what was different about this game. Then it hit me. The draw distance. It's massive. Now, not all levels are like this. In fact, the game will use fog to cleverly hide sections to make a level feel even bigger. But when you're in Mogadishu, in the heart of the city, the devs crank up that fog to the max distance and you can see the urban sprawl all around you. You can look down the road and see buildings and alleyways all the way down. You can look around from a vantage spot and see endless rooftops. And the game is using clever tricks to enhance its scale. Like, the city of Mogadishu is rendered very small. Yeah, this is the city on a map. I'm sure there's a lot of reused intersections and alleyways, but they're using it cleverly to trick you into thinking that you're in a massive, all-encompassing dense city. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with having a lower draw distance. Devs in the early 2000s needed every way they could find to prevent graphics cards from exploding. Does that mean to slather your game in fog? Absolutely. Anything to keep my GeForce FX series card from turning into a molten husk. But this was NovaLogic's bread and butter. The benefit of Delta Force using an engine designed for a helicopter series meant that the engine was already optimized for this. They had already figured out how to render giant open environments. All they had to do was scale the ground assets, like players and buildings, up to a level that would look acceptable, but also wouldn't cause their computers to turn into PowerPoint presentations, something many other series had trouble doing. What this results in is a game that looks pretty flat, with static flat lighting, low-res textures, some low-res enemies and assets, basic building and terrain geometry, but all done on an amazingly impressive scale. It still is able to capture the scale of a large, massive city, even if it has the occasional ugly-looking interior or hallway. Delta Force also uses an adjusting LOD. The further away you are, the lower the texture resolutions and the less polygons assets will have. It's a trade-off, and I think it works. Moving beyond tech, the presentation itself is still pretty nice. The devs utilized a lot of color and weren't afraid to make the coastline of Somalia visually striking. Bright sunny sand dunes and arid fields of grass, or some green wetlands with rivers and flora. Lush palm trees line the edges of dusty cities. I'm a junkie when it comes to video game environments, so I love this stuff. Going back to the city, I think they really nailed the density here. Prior Delta Force games gave the impression that the engine could only handle a couple of buildings, maybe cluttered together, but not too many. You had small little villages, isolated military bases, and that was kind of it. That sums up a lot of old Delta Force. But with Black Hawk Down, you have tightly packed roads and alleyways. They stretch far into the distance, and levels that have you navigate around a claustrophobic city are easily the best missions in the game. There's a few sections where your only objective is to go from point A to B, and the challenge is simply getting from one side of the city to another. So you have to carefully move block to block, sneaking through alleyways and making your way through concrete buildings and rundown shantytowns. You have these open courtyards, crisscrossing intersections, rooftops, and vantage spots. For the time, this is all amazingly detailed, and there still aren't many games that are able to capture this feeling. Like, there can be an enemy hiding around every corner. And to talk more about that, we have to talk about the campaign. The mission structure takes a bit of getting used to. First, the game is very happy letting you play the story out of order. For the first half of the game, you have 3 mission slots. Basically, you can play any one of the 3 missions in any order you want. Whichever one you beat gets replaced with the next one down the list. and so on. And you can keep picking and choosing until the mission Irene. Then you have to play them in order. At first, this lets you experiment with different playstyles, and I guess it's useful in that regard. These mostly can be played out of chronological order, although it won't affect the story too much. Aside from the few missions that are taken from the Black Hawk Down incident in real life, there really isn't any story that occurs outside of that. For the most part, the base game's campaign follows the same structure. Every mission lets you select a loadout. One primary, one secondary, one explosive, not including a frag grenade. You get grenades like frags and flashes automatically. The mission will start with a briefing, usually with you riding some vehicle to the mission area, where you get told what your objectives are. I will say, I love the helicopter drops, because you can actually walk around inside the chopper as it's moving. Same goes for other vehicles. You can just jump into a truck or helicopter, and the game will automatically carry you along. There's a handful of missions that have you on a turret, and these parts of the games do kind of make me wonder, was there any inspiration here for Modern Warfare? This game came out the same year Call of Duty 1 released, and while that game certainly had way better scripting, there are moments in Delta Force where I genuinely wanted to know if Infinity Ward was taking notes for COD 4. You have helicopter sequences, gun turret sequences, riding and shooting from a truck. It's hard to say if this influence came directly from Delta Force, because I know Delta Force took these tropes from other pieces of media, including the movie of the same name. I could totally be wrong, but I don't recall any other FPS games prior to Delta Force that were doing these kinds of things. These cinematic scripted moments for a modern military shooter. As far as I know, Black Hawk Down is one of the first games to do this kind of thing. And years later, Call of Duty would start doing it, and would essentially become the poster child for it. I thought it was worth mentioning. Aside from those turret sequences, you're going to be dropped off and sent to an objective, and you're on your own. The game is linear. Despite giving you big open levels to walk through, it's one objective at a time. So you gotta go here, do a thing, now go here, do another thing. Destroy an objective, enter a building, clear out enemies, capture enemies, defend a position. It's all pretty basic. And while the levels can be expansive, they usually route you through a fairly obvious corridor. Honestly, the best missions are the ones where they add variety. One of my favorites was this nighttime stealth mission, where you have to sneak through the dark streets of Mogadishu using NVGs. What made this mission really fun is that there weren't many blocked off roads or paths. You could just walk through the city wherever you wanted, just to get from point A to B. And that was really fun. It made me consider the sightlines of these open spaces, and I was actively checking my map to find the safest path. It's in these moments where Delta Force really comes into its own. I joked that this game may have influenced Call of Duty, but here is one very distinct difference between this game and what Call of Duty would turn into, or at least what modern military shooters would turn into. It's this open approach to level design. There aren't many modern military shooters that can match what Delta Force is doing with its levels. And yes, this can of course lead to some clunkiness. The engine is very restrictive when it comes to handling scripting, but the trade-off is having giant environments with no single pathway. I referenced Operation Flashpoint, or ARMA earlier, and no, Delta Force is no ARMA, nor is it a Call of Duty. I would argue that Delta Force Black Hawk Down has managed to find a nice sweet spot in between both of those two types of designs. You have missions with cinematic helicopter rides and turret sections. You have these moments that feel like an action movie. Conversely, you have slower, more tense moments where you and a squad are hoofing it street to street without much handholding. Most of the tension in this game comes from figuring out how to get through a city. I think that for all its faults, this is why the Delta Force games, Black Hawk Down especially, resonates so much with a particular type of gamer. There are plenty of other games that also do the action-packed cinematic moments, but playing them, you're going to get stuck with a hyper-linear, restrictive, on-rails shooting gallery that refuses to give you any agency. Black Hawk Down is not like that. It gives you those action-packed cinematic moments, but then it just throws you in and says, here's a gun, here's a map, good luck. What's weird is that I do videos on lots of old games, and whenever I do, I get a flood of commenters all saying, to my annoyance, the same thing. They should remake this game. It annoys me because, hey, the game already exists. Just go play the original as God intended. You don't need some Unreal Engine remake to play it. However, playing through Black Hawk Down made me think that I could actually see a remake really improving this game. And yeah, they are making a remake of this game. They haven't released any info about it, and honestly, it's a coin toss if it's going to be good or just a half-assed reboot. However, outside of that remake, there's potential here. There's mechanics that this game offers that I would love to see expanded upon. I'd love to see co-op. I'd love to see more intelligent enemies that can take a few hits and still fight back. I'd want to see even larger levels that are even more open, maybe something even more accurate to the streets of 1993 Mogadishu, and a better squad command system. That would be greatly appreciated. Yeah, I could see how a remake might fix this game, but I don't know how much faith I have in the one that they're actually making. We can only say for sure once it actually comes out, but who knows? There's definitely potential here, and I wish some studio would just expand upon it, instead of turning it into a Battlefield clone, which seems to be what Tencent is doing. Delta Force Black Hawk Down is such an interesting premise too. I can tell why so many people gravitated towards this game back in the day. It was the era of faceless terrorists and goons dominating most military tactical shooters, and just shooters in general, I guess. But here was a game that threw you in real life events. It was a game that kind of had real history. And don't get me wrong, World War II shooters were very common. But World War II, that was Grandpa's war. World War II is something we learn in school. We see textbooks about it, black and white photos. The battle for Mogadishu, this would have been 10 years before the game came out. This was headline news, TV coverage. It was a shocking loss of life for both sides, the deadliest engagement for the UN. It was an event that by 2003 was still fairly relevant, thanks to books, movies, and I guess further military conflicts. NovaLogic had a track record for trying to depict a real-world conflict, no matter how recent it was. A year earlier, with Delta Force Task Force Dagger, NovaLogic was already trying to make a game about the invasion of Afghanistan. Keep in mind, this was 2002, barely a year after the real invasion happened. With Black Hawk Down, despite the deviation from real-life events, it's clear to me that these devs and level designers know their history. There are many allusions to real-life events that have fictionalized counterparts. There are missions that, yeah, they might be fictional, but they very obviously allude to real-life events. Maybe this was due to the developers not wanting to depict real-life tragedies or atrocities. Here's a notable example. There's an early mission where you have to relieve a convoy of Pakistani UN soldiers from a surrounding enemy force. This is an obvious reference to the very real attack that happened in June of 1993, where the SNA coordinated an attack on Pakistani UN peacekeepers. Now, the mission in-game is fictional. It takes place a whole month before the real event, and in-game, it's a single attack on one convoy of vehicles, while in real life, it was a series of coordinated attacks across the city. But it's a little spice of real history that the devs have sprinkled into their game. Because yeah, depicting this stuff can lead to risky territory. Depicting tragedy in a game about shooting people for fun is still touchy. I remember when people got up in arms back in the day about 6 Days in Fallujah. Hell, they're still doing it. While this stuff might shock people, I actually find that it's really refreshing. I kind of respect the fact that NovaLogic wants to depict a real conflict. A lot of the time, military shooters censor themselves so bad that their conflicts end up feeling bland. Oh yeah, Call of Duty. Take the 80s and 90s and don't let players actually duke it out as two rivaling nations. Just make us faceless fictional goons. Don't offend anybody. Hey, does anyone remember the Desert Storm mod for Battlefield, where you could straight up play as Saddam's Iraqis in the Gulf War? I kind of miss games like that. I like when games are willing to show real historical events, because even now it's still pretty rare. Aside from World War II games, there's not many games that try and have this level of authenticity, even if a lot of these missions are fictional. Another great example is the follow-up mission. It was that stealth mission from earlier. You gotta sneak into Mogadishu in the dead of night and take out a radio tower. It's just you, a small group of Delta operators, sneaking through darkened streets. Not a single streetlight or lit building. It's kind of a tense mission because you're struggling to get a lay of the land in a city that no longer has any power. It's only illuminated by small fires. A mechanic that lets you utilize your night vision. But it's also historically relevant too, because yeah, Mogadishu at this time was in the middle of a civil war. This is what it would have looked like. And while it's a simple stealth mission, it's got a deep historical context. In-game, we're taking out a propaganda radio station. This is clearly a reference to Radio Mogadishu. This was a propaganda radio station that was controlled by the SNA, and they were using it not just to broadcast propaganda, but to whip up the public into a frenzy to start attacking the UN. In fact, the attack earlier on Pakistani peacekeepers came about because the SNA was worried that the UN was trying to take down their propaganda radio. One of the inspection sites that the UN was trying to get to was the radio station. In fact, the attack was so brutal against the UN peacekeepers that the UN made it a priority to immediately stop the radio station. This event was shocking to the Western world, the US especially. In the immediate aftermath, the real-life Delta Force began training for their entry to Mogadishu. That's why I mentioned earlier how real-life Delta was not part of the conflict at this time. This event brought Delta Force into Mogadishu. So I hope you can understand what I'm getting at. The devs are carefully working with the history they have and are using it to tell their story. It's a fictional story. They're fictionalizing events, obviously, but they're using them as references to real-life battles and missions. What would have been just a generic level becomes steeped in historical context. As a guy who likes his history, this game is fascinating. By the way, I want to quick say this. This game missed out on a really cool, badass title. The game is called Delta Force Black Hawk Down. It's capitalizing on the popularity of the movie and the book. Unfortunately, the title just makes it confusing. Is it a movie tie-in game? No, it just shares the name of the book. It has nothing to do with the Ridley Scott movie. Is it a hyper-accurate portrayal of the conflict then? No, it kind of loosely follows history, but it's doing its own thing. To this day, people still have no idea what to make of this game. When they announced the remake, there were people who weren't aware of Delta Force who thought it was just a movie tie-in game for the Ridley Scott movie. Oh, they're making a game for that movie from 20 years ago, huh? No, it's for the game, not the movie. God, it's a bad title. So that's already confusing. But there was a much cooler name right there that would have been way better. Okay, for some context, Delta Force as a series has some really fun subtitles. You have Land Warrior, Task Force Dagger, cool military codenames. So what should this game have been called? I'll tell you. It should have been called Delta Force Gothic Serpent. Operation Gothic Serpent was the name of the entire military operation around Mogadishu. It spanned 2 months, and it marked when the real-life Delta Force were brought into the region. It also includes the Black Hawk Down incident as well. It's a much cooler name, and for a game over 20 years old, I still think it was a missed opportunity. Yeah, I'm petty. The titular event is actually shown pretty well, albeit truncated. It follows the operation with Rangers and Delta flying into the city to seize SNA personnel. As a Delta Force operator, you're sitting on one of the little birds, and man, even if the devs weren't able to fully capture the scale of Mogadishu, they still did a pretty good job making you feel like you're really there. We're flying low beneath the rooftops, in between tightly packed buildings, and this looks exaggerated for dramatic effect, but no, the real pilots were pulling off maneuvers just like this. And just like eyewitness accounts, there was immediately shooting the second they touched down. The game stretches history a little bit here, because you play as a Delta Force operator who is part of the initial raid, who gets to see the first Black Hawk, Super 6-1, get downed. You're part of the convoy that goes initially looking for them, and you're also part of the team that has to survive past nightfall. A little exaggerated, but again, all of these little touches feel shockingly authentic. Once Super 6-1 gets shot down, you have a convoy trying to find it. However, they are all routed through the city in a winding and confusing path, where you're getting shot at from all angles by SNA, and you ultimately aren't able to get to the crash site. On paper, this seems like an excuse to have a long, meandering vehicle gunner section. I imagine most players here would think nothing of it. It's just a winding corridor, nothing to think about. However, this is pretty fucking accurate to the real trouble that first rescue convoy had. Because as they were trying to find the first crash site, the second Black Hawk, Super 6-4, had been shot down. And so you had this convoy already full of wounded men who were struggling to figure out where to go. Recon helicopters were telling them to take certain turns and go down certain alleys, but the trucks just weren't able to figure out where to go. The convoy had to do loops and U-turns, and twice they were within a block of the first crash site, but they got routed away both times. By the way, this is where I'm going to recommend reading the book if you haven't already. The devs know their history, and I respect them for that. The event takes place across multiple missions, and man, it does not spare any moment from the battle. The entire city is shooting at us. And yeah, the real-life Battle of Mogadishu was just about like this. From every rooftop, window, and alleyway, some guy with an AK was firing at Rangers and Delta. It's a part of the game that you can tell the devs have saved all of their energy for this. It's a shot of adrenaline too. These are the missions that had the most time and effort put into them, and it's the highlight of the whole campaign. you slowly start to regroup with scattered rangers. It's stressful as you fight block by block, ducking through alleyways as bad guys shoot at you from every conceivable direction. I'm peeking out from corners, bounding with my squad. For the first time in this game, I genuinely feel tense, as I know a few stray shots could be the end of me. Look at those quick saves. For some missions, the game will give you 3 quick saves. Most will give you 5. For these missions, 9 quick saves. And the devs aren't messing around. You need all of those. And the game may play it fast and loose with bullet damage towards the player, but I will say, it's pretty accurate for how many hits from a 50 cal it takes to kill someone. It's tense because unlike other missions, it doesn't feel like you can quite clear out an area. It feels like for every dude you kill, 3 more take his place. All the while you need to be careful because there's still crowds of civilians running around. Later on in the night, there's a part where you have to clear out mortar teams. And yeah, this really happened. Delta and Rangers had to go out in the middle of the night with only the cover of little birds flying around. Another interesting thing is that what apparently happened is when night fell, most of the lower level peons for the SNA, regular dudes who just picked up a gun to shoot at Americans, they decided to go home for the night. So the only soldiers who were left fighting were the dedicated and more experienced militia fighters. But in this game, this has the unexpected benefit of not making you worried about the ROE, because there are no civilians around. Anyone who chooses to be up past dark in downtown Mogadishu is not up to anything good. Everyone's a hostile. After the tense night of hunting down a mortar crew, we finally get our rescue convoy, and thus begins the Mogadishu Mile, a tense pullout where a line of convoys and soldiers booked it out of the city, all the while still getting shot at by SNA soldiers. The rescue convoy was gargantuan. 100 vehicles. You had Pakistani tanks, Malaysian APCs, Americans had their own APCs, trucks, and Humvees. It wasn't just a rescue team, it was an invasion force. The real divergence of history comes after this mission. It's the last mission of the game, and you have to kill General Adid, which never happened. In real life, he was killed years after the battle. He was killed by his own men, too. It's like the game felt it needed to end the story on some sort of conclusion by just killing the head honcho, I guess, even if it doesn't make any historical sense. It's hard to say what happened here, because, guys, this is not Wolfenstein. You don't have to have the player kill the big baddie at the end. You could have just used some other 2-bit lieutenant, but I digress. It should also be worth mentioning the Team Sabre expansion. Team Sabre was Black Hawk Down's only expansion, and it's pretty well regarded by fans. It brings in 2 brand new campaigns, which are both very short. In total, I'd say this entire expansion is a little over half the playtime as the base game. It's still pretty fun. The Columbia campaign is set across dense jungles and rivers, and it's a refreshing environment to play around in. Lots of green foliage and swamps. The Iranian campaign is also interesting, as it has you fight up against an actual professional military. You're fighting in military bases, oil rigs, oil fields. You also get a few new guns, the G36, the G3, and the PSG-1. It's actually pretty cool that you can use all these expansion guns in the main campaign as well. I thought they were nice additions. As fun as the missions are, I did find that the devs were really struggling with the limitations of their engine. A great example is this oil rig section, which at first I thought was pretty great. First off, it's a visually cool level. It's set in the dead of night in the Persian Gulf. You hop into a boat and you get ferried seamlessly over to the oil rig. Once you get on board though, the scripting literally starts to break down. I'm noticing there's a lot of pathing issues with your teammates. The hostage we were trying to rescue at some point fell off and died. The game wanted you to put down satchel charges to then jump into the helicopter, escape, and then blow up the oil rig. But this section would constantly fucking break. I think it had issues if you wanted to put down the satchel charges earlier, or if you decided to put down the satchel charges too late. There was a point where I would have all the satchel charges ready, but the fucking helicopter would not take off. We would just sit there on the helipad and my game's fucked. I gotta reload a quick save. I got stuck on this part for like 20 minutes. I was not happy by the end of it. I think this is where the game really starts to break down, as the devs probably wished they had way better scripted environments. I can only imagine how limited their mission editor tools were. They were stuck with these awkwardly placed objective markers that, if you did these things out of sync, would break your game. I often feel like the mission tools in Delta Force are about on par to those player missions you can build in Arma. Overall, I think both campaigns are alright. We're kind of rambling right now, so I guess it's fair to talk about the game's shockingly competent PS2 counterpart. 2 years later, in 2005, Delta Force Black Hawk Down was released for the PS2. A year later, so did Team Sabre. Both games had a fairly mixed reception on console. It was 2005. The 360 was out. A year later, the PS3 was out. So it makes sense. Bringing an old PC game to these consoles this late into their lifespan was a bit odd. But since their release, they've kind of gained nearly cult status. I mean, the Delta Force brand is itself a cult franchise, but these ports especially. Console ports weren't anything new for Delta Force. In 2002, there was Delta Force Urban Warfare for the PS1. A little late to the party as always. But the PS2 port was something unique, as it was a full-blown remake. Yeah, we're talking new graphics, a new tutorial mission, even the combat has been somewhat reworked. Guns are a bit less accurate, there's more variety in weapon handling, and what's that? They made a more useful squad command system? What? Squad mechanics in my Delta Force? I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this before, where a PC game gets a full facelift and remaster, but only for a console which, by this point, was already on the way out. And this is just the PS2 port. The game got ported to Xbox as well, but it was just the original. No Team Sabre expansion, and that was a mostly bare-bones port of the PC release. But the PS2 gets both a Black Hawk Down and Team Sabre remaster, and they basically play like totally different games. How did this happen? Oh, Rebellion developed this port. That makes a lot more sense. They also made that PS1 Delta Force game as well. But Black Hawk Down on the PS2 is definitely something to behold. Visually, it looks pretty good for a PS2 title. Gameplay's alright. You're translating a PC shooter to the console. It's to be expected. It's no Halo killer, but it did come with a bunch of features. Online multiplayer with split screen. There's even an added progression system baked into the campaign. And that squad system is way more robust. Oh yeah, don't think I wouldn't mention this. Rebellion nailed the squad mechanics. On a gamepad too. There's a medic that will heal you, there's a guy who'll give you ammo, they can supply you or your team, they all move like a unit, and the AI pathing is not ass like it is on the PC. It's a pretty incredible revamp. It's a shame that Black Hawk Down and Team Sabre for the PS2 got middling reviews, because they're both pretty fun console shooters. Although, I have a hunch as to why people passed over these games. Black Hawk Down for the PS2 came out the exact same year as Republic Commando, Brothers in Arms, and SWAT 4. And a year later, Team Sabre for the PS2 released alongside Rainbow Six Vegas. I'm sorry, there's no way to slice it. They were running laps around Delta Force, which is kind of tragic, because through its faults, these PS2 ports are very good games. My complaints are very minor, and they mostly stem from how the levels are a bit smaller in scope, as well as the visuals. I was praising the PC version for having a really big draw distance, but on PS2, that thick fog is back, and so levels feel much smaller and more cramped than they did on Windows. A few levels aren't affected by this. I found the tight streets of Mogadishu are represented pretty well here, but those open environments where you're able to see far into the distance are gone, and the game has a constant haziness to it. It still looks pretty good. I love that heatwave effect. Rebellion did a good job adding a layer of ambiance to the game, but this also leads me to my second complaint. As nice as this game looks, I think the devs made Somalia look too much like the deserts of Iraq. By 2005, modern military shooters were slowly picking up steam, and so you had more games embrace this aesthetic. Those dry, dusty deserts of the Middle East, sand dunes, dusty rundown buildings. This works for a game that's set in, say, Iraq. But Somalia is a coastal country. Mogadishu is right on the ocean. It may be hot, but it's also quite humid. There's a surprising amount of green. It's tropical. Some of the early missions are set in the Jubba Valley, which the PC version shows as being very green and lush. But in the PS2 port, it's all sand dunes. I admit I enjoy some of the visual changes, but I feel quite a few creative liberties were made to make you forget that you're in Mogadishu, and not, say, a nameless Middle Eastern village. The PS2 port looks like how a cinematic military shooter probably should look. Grimy and gritty, lots of color correction to make areas seem dark and war-torn. I feel like they were trying to match the color temperature of the movie, which I'm sure wasn't a coincidence. But for the PC version, I just kind of enjoy how clear and sharp it is visually. It's colorful when it needs to be, bright and sunny, just pleasantly normal, which is what I appreciate about it. But my complaints end there. For the most part, I found the ports to be very good. but that's no surprise. This is Rebellion we're talking about. Making content-rich, enjoyable games on a shoestring budget for low-spec hardware was their forte in the early 2000s. And it's kind of amazing how the enhanced squad commands make you feel way more connected to your team. I actually felt protective over my guys. They were my squad, and I was actively making decisions and following strategies to get us to the end of a mission alive. So if you're interested, I still think they're worth picking up. The games are pretty easy to get too. I see them on sale for bargain bin prices all the time at retro game stores. Although, PCSX2 emulation with a fan patch can get these games running at full 60. So long as you stick to software mode, these titles run fine via emulator. Although, you may need to overclock PCSX2. Otherwise, you're going to get some really bad slowdown. Yeah, these games were punching far above their weight for a PS2 port. Of course, I probably wouldn't be talking about Delta Force right now, were it not for the fact that its name is in the news at the moment. Delta Force Hawk Ops. Now just Delta Force. Great. As a free-to-play Battlefield clone. More specifically, a Battlefield 2042 clone, with operators that all have wacky sci-fi abilities and gimmicks. And an extraction mode. I think Delta Force as a brand does have potential. And going for a multiplayer angle isn't that bad of an idea. The old Delta Force games always had multiplayer as a staple feature, and Black Hawk Down had full 50-player lobbies. This was a year after Battlefield 1942, and the same year as PlanetSide 1. It was one of the few games doing this, and despite its basic combat, it was pretty revolutionary. I think the idea of focusing on larger scale combat in large open maps does work to Delta Force's name. I just don't think explicitly making it a Battlefield clone is the right way to do it. Tencent apparently owns the brand now, and so some Chinese developer, Teamy, is making the reboot, as well as the remake. Yeah, in addition to the sci-fi free-to-play multiplayer mode, there's going to be a full-price remake of Delta Force Black Hawk Down's campaign, of which information regarding it has been very scarce. This developer is a weird one. They've made, as far as I can tell, mostly shovelware games. Hey, I guess NovaLogic wasn't so different. But aside from a bunch of forgettable MMOs, the only titles of note that stand out are COD Mobile and Pokemon Unite, which I'm not sure that's a sign of confidence or concern. The Delta Force community, which somehow still exists online, I guess,
there are dozens of us. Dozens!
Is rightly skeptical about this reboot. On one hand, it's nice to have a long-dead series brought back. In the trailers for the remake, they were showing overlaid footage of the original Black Hawk Down game. And it looked pretty cool. Like we were finally coming back to this series after a long hiatus. But then you look at the free-to-play game, and it's nothing like Delta Force at all. It's Battlefield. Battlefield 2042 to be exact. Down to that ugly teal HUD. The original series has been pulled from Steam. Teamy doesn't care about the fans. They just want the brand name. Also, this is going to be the only opportunity I have to ever talk about this. In the late 90s, NovaLogic made Armored Fist. That was their tank series. And before they settled on that name, one of their early ideas was the title Battlefield 2000. But they ditched the name. So NovaLogic could have hypothetically taken the Battlefield trademark along with the year that follows it. Because yeah, I'm sure you have a lot of brands that have Battlefield in the title. But NovaLogic could have had Battlefield space insert year and prevented Battlefield 1942 from ever having that trademark. It's just kind of a fun what if. I don't have a lot of faith in the reboot. Tencent wants Battlefield. They're making a rip-off Battlefield instead. I don't know why they're trying to remake the original game. Maybe they just want a cinematic FPS to compete with COD. I don't know. All I know is I'm probably never going to touch it. I'm sorry, but a game that has kernel-level anti-cheat Chinese spyware is never going to touch my hard drive. The most unforgivable sin is how they removed the original games from Steam, or GOG, and it's probably going to stay that way indefinitely. I have no clue why. I really hope it's just legal trouble. Maybe I just don't want to accept that it's something as evil as forcing consumers to buy their new game instead of the old ones, but I can't put it past them. Delta Force as a series deserves way more respect. It was a franchise that was always surrounded by other titans, yet it somehow managed to carve out its own little niche. Its gameplay, while basic, was undeniably fun, and as the years went on, NovaLogic came closer and closer to making their military epic. There would have been good ways of rebooting the series. For one, make all the games available and do a full re-release. That would have been nice. Go hire a studio like Night Dive. Give them the source code, all the documentation, If they can't do the whole series, then at least do a re-release of Black Hawk Down. Let them get in there and fix some of the bugs. Add more graphics options. Let players customize AI difficulty. Update the mission editor. Bring the multiplayer back online. Hell, if you're really ballsy, add the PS2 port as a separate playable campaign, just like they did with Quake 1 and Quake 2. Make this a big re-release, and hold a little event for it or something. It's a beloved series, and despite how obscure it is, it doesn't really justify the ringer it's gone through. I'd love to see a proper reboot from this franchise, a game that expands on the elements that made it unique. Something in between a linear shooter and something way more open and unscripted. Something that's not too afraid to delve into real history. Because here's the thing, people are starving for a good military shooter. A classic one too. Not one with an extraction mode, not one that has spastic movement, or a battle pass, or fuck ugly skins with Fortnite characters, or celebrities, or fucking whatever Call of Duty is doing these days. Jesus Christ. We're desperate for a good grounded shooter, for dusty, sandy 90s era military hardware, for those classic sand camo uniforms, for M16s, for Blackhawks. Delta Force used to be a series grounded in realistic military aesthetics. Sorry, but having girls that shoot electric bows and arrows is fucking embarrassing. Maybe ignore the reboot for the time being. Check out the original. I still think it's worth checking out if you're curious. Be warned, you are not jumping into a timeless classic. You're going to be swimming through old, clunky game design. It is a niche PC series from the early 2000s. You need to expect bugs, odd quirks, but all of it dripping with soul. It also has the added benefit of not installing CCP spyware. It really is a charming game. It was trying to do a lot as an FPS, and it was an important step in the genre of modern military shooters. It's fun, it's dated, it's innovative, it's clunky and glitchy as hell. You kind of know what you're getting into. I thought it was a fun time, but I do have an acquired taste for this sort of thing. Team Sabre's pretty good too, and I'd say the PS2 port is worth checking out. That's the video. This would have been a Christmas game, but things got delayed thanks to Halo and Gundam. 2024 was a pretty big year, so here's hoping that 2025 will be even better. Take care, dudes. I'll see you next time.